Marcus Johnson sat in the back corner of the small Atlanta diner, watching the woman behind the counter laugh with an elderly customer like they were old friends. He'd come in wearing a plain gray hoodie and worn sneakers, nothing that hinted at the empire he'd built from nothing, and he liked it that way. Ava Carter didn't know he owned 3 tech companies and a real estate portfolio worth more than the entire block she worked on. To her, he was just Marcus, the quiet man who came in 3 times a week and always tipped well but never bragged about it. She refilled his coffee without being asked and asked him how his mother was doing, a question no other woman had ever bothered to ask him first. He'd met her 2 months earlier when his car broke down outside this very diner, and she'd brought him a plate of food on the house while he waited for the tow truck, refusing his attempt to pay double. There was something about her steadiness that unsettled him in the best way, because every woman before her had wanted something the moment they sensed money nearby. Ava never looked at his shoes or his watch, the things he'd learned to hide on purpose, because she was too busy actually listening to what he said. He found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone in years, about growing up with nothing, about a mother who worked 2 jobs, about a father who left before Marcus could remember his face. Tonight, as she wiped down the counter and the last customers trickled out, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. "Ava, can I ask you something serious?" She nodded, drying her hands on her apron, giving him her full attention the way she always did. "Would you come with me this weekend? I want you to meet my mother." Ava's face lit up with something so genuine it nearly broke him, and she said yes without hesitation, without asking where they were going or what she should wear. She had no idea that this invitation was actually a test, one that had already broken the hearts of 3 women before her, and one wrong reaction would end everything before it truly began. Saturday morning came with gray skies threatening rain, and Marcus picked Ava up in an old pickup truck he kept registered under a fake business named specifically for moments like this. She climbed in wearing a simple yellow sundress, her hair pulled back, smelling like vanilla and something warm, and she didn't even glance at the dented door or the cracked dashboard. As they drove out of the city and the buildings grew shorter and more tired-looking, Marcus watched her from the corner of his eye, waiting for the question he knew was coming, the one every woman eventually asked. But Ava just rolled down her window and talked about the trees, about how her grandmother used to drive these same back roads to visit family in Macon. The neighborhood appeared slowly, like a wound revealing itself, with sagging porches and chain-link fences and a corner store with bars on the windows. Marcus's chest tightened the way it always did when he came back here, memories crashing into him of hunger and cold winters, and his mother crying quietly in the next room, so he wouldn't hear. He pulled up to a small house with peeling blue paint and a yard more dirt than grass, the same house he'd grown up in, the same house his mother refused to leave no matter how much money he offered her. Ava looked at the house, then at him, and said something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. "This is where you grew up? It's got good bones, Marcus. I can already tell it's got a lot of love in it." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just opened her door and led her up the cracked walkway toward the front porch where his mother, Dorothy, was already waiting with her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Dorothy had seen this exact scene play out 3 times before, 3 different women walking up that same path with their noses slightly turned up, their smiles slightly too tight. Marcus held his breath as Ava climbed the porch steps, knowing that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would tell him everything he needed to know about whether this woman was real or just better at hiding her disappointment than the others. Dorothy Johnson had buried a husband who didn't deserve grief, raised a son alone in a neighborhood that tried to swallow him whole, and survived long enough to watch that son become a man rich enough to buy the whole street if he wanted. She'd also watched 3 women come through her front door pretending to be kind while their eyes cataloged every crack in the ceiling and every stain on the carpet, women who complimented the house in voices dripping with pity. So when Ava stepped onto that porch and reached out to shake her hand instead of waiting to be invited, Dorothy felt something shift, though decades of disappointment kept her guard firmly in place. "Mrs. Johnson, it's so good to finally meet you," Ava said, and there wasn't a single ounce of performance in it. Inside, the house smelled like it always did, like old wood and the ghost of cooking grease, and Dorothy watched Ava's eyes move around the room not with judgment, but with curiosity, lingering on the family photos crowding the mantel. Ava asked about the picture of young Marcus missing his front teeth, asked about the woman standing beside Dorothy in a church photo from years ago, asked questions that proved she actually wanted to know the answers. Dorothy found herself softening despite every instinct telling her to wait, to watch, to see how long this one would last before she found an excuse to leave early. Marcus stood near the doorway, arms crossed, studying the interaction like a man watching a verdict being read, because his mother's opinion mattered more to him than anyone else's in the world. By the time they sat down at the small kitchen table, its surface scarred with years of use, Dorothy had decided to test the girl herself in a way Marcus hadn't planned. "Baby, do you cook?" she asked, sliding a worn recipe card across the table, one stained with grease and thyme, a family recipe for smothered chicken that had been passed down for 3 generations. Ava picked it up gently like it was something precious, read it twice, and asked if she could help make it right then, rolling up her sleeves before anyone could answer. Dorothy caught Marcus's eye across the kitchen, and for the first time in years, she saw something flicker there that looked dangerously close to hope. Right before the lights in the kitchen flickered and went out completely. The power outage sent the house into sudden shadow, and Dorothy sighed with the weariness of someone who'd lived through this exact scenario more times than she could count. "Breaker's been bad for months," she muttered, fumbling for the candles she kept in a kitchen drawer for precisely this reason. Marcus immediately reached for his phone, ready to call someone, anyone, to fix it within the hour, but Ava touched his arm gently and shook her head. "Let me see the breaker box first," she said, surprising both of them, explaining that her father had been an electrician and she'd spent her teenage years handing him tools and learning more than she'd ever expected to need. Marcus followed her to the back porch with a flashlight, watching as she examined the old breaker box with the same calm confidence she brought to everything, flipping switches and tracing wires with careful fingers. "It's just a loose connection, nothing dangerous, but it needs proper rewiring soon," she explained, and within 10 minutes the lights flickered back on inside, much to Dorothy's amazement and quiet pride. Standing there in the dim porch light, rain beginning to patter against the roof, Marcus felt words rising in his throat that he hadn't planned to say, words about who he really was and why he'd brought her here. He opened his mouth to tell her everything, that the house was a test, that he was worth more money than she could imagine, that he needed to know if she could love the boy from this house before she ever knew about the empire he'd built. But before he could speak, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket, an unknown number calling for the 3rd time that hour, and something about the urgency of it made him step away to answer. The voice on the other end was sharp, familiar, and cold in a way that made his stomach drop instantly. "Marcus, it's Brianna. We need to talk, and trust me, you don't want me showing up at your mother's house to say what I have to say." He turned back toward the kitchen window, watching Ava through the rain-streaked glass as she laughed with his mother over the stove, completely unaware that an ex-girlfriend who knew his entire secret had just resurfaced with a voice full of threats. Marcus ended the call quickly, telling Brianna he'd handle whatever this was later, his jaw tight with a tension he tried to hide as he walked back into the warm kitchen. The smell of smothered chicken and rice filled the small house now, rich and familiar, and for a moment it pulled him fully back into the present, back to a childhood Sunday when food was the only luxury his mother could afford to give him. Ava stood at the stove stirring the pot exactly the way Dorothy instructed, asking thoughtful questions about seasoning, listening intently when Dorothy explained that this recipe came from her own mother, who'd learned it from a woman she'd worked for as a housekeeper decades ago. Dorothy's voice cracked slightly telling that story, and Ava reached over without thinking and squeezed her hand. A small gesture that meant everything to a woman rarely shown that kind of tenderness by strangers. They ate dinner at the small table with mismatched chairs, and Marcus found himself laughing in a way he hadn't laughed in years, genuinely, from his belly, as Ava told stories about disastrous diner customers and Dorothy added commentary that made even Ava cry with laughter. There was no pretense in the room, no performance. Just 3 people enjoying a simple meal in a house that had seen more hardship than most people could imagine. And Marcus realized with a jolt that this was the happiest he'd felt in longer than he could remember. He watched Ava clear the table without being asked, scraping plates and running water before Dorothy could protest. moving through the kitchen like she'd been doing it her whole life rather than for the first time that evening. Every motion she made chipped further away at the wall he'd built after years of being used by women who saw dollar signs instead of a man. As the evening wound down and rain continued tapping steadily against the windows, Dorothy pulled Marcus aside near the back door while Ava washed the last of the dishes, humming softly to herself. "Baby, I don't know what test you're running on this girl, because I know you, and I know exactly what this visit is," Dorothy whispered, her eyes serious and searching his face. "But you'd be a fool to let her walk out of here without telling her the truth, because girls like her don't come around twice in one lifetime." Marcus nodded, his throat tight, fully intending to tell Ava everything before the night ended. But as he turned back toward the kitchen, his phone lit up again with a text message that made his blood run cold. A photo of him and Ava walking into the house earlier that day, sent from a number he didn't recognize, with 3 words underneath. "I see you." Marcus stared at the message until the screen dimmed on its own, his mind racing through every possibility of who could have followed them, who could have known to find this house at all. Only a handful of people knew about his past here, and fewer still knew he sometimes brought women to test their hearts against his mother's front porch, which meant whoever sent this message had been digging into his life with real intention. He slipped the phone into his pocket and forced his face into calm as he walked back into the kitchen, not wanting to alarm Ava or his mother before he understood what he was dealing with. Ava noticed anyway, because she'd been watching him closely all evening, and she asked softly if everything was all right, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. He told her it was just work, a half-truth that tasted bitter in his mouth, especially after the warmth of the evening they'd just shared. As they said goodbye to Dorothy near the front door, the older woman pulled Ava into a tight hug that lasted several seconds longer than politeness required, whispering something into her ear that made Ava's eyes glisten with unexpected emotion. Marcus didn't ask what was said, but he saw the way Ava glanced back at the small house as they walked to the truck, a look of genuine affection on her face rather than relief at finally leaving, and that look settled something deep and uncertain in his chest. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the porch light cast long shadows across the dirt yard, shadows that seemed, for just a moment, to shift unnaturally near the old oak tree at the property line. Marcus caught the movement from the corner of his eye, a shape that didn't belong among the branches. Gone the instant he turned to look directly at it. He helped Ava into the truck and circled around to check the yard more carefully, finding nothing but wet grass and an old tool shed slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered locking it that afternoon. As he climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, he glanced once more in his rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind them, and his stomach turned cold at what he saw. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the yard, watching the truck disappear into the night, someone who had clearly been there long enough to see and photograph everything. Brianna Ross had spent 2 years convincing herself she was over Marcus Johnson. 2 years building a life that looked successful enough to mask the bitterness underneath. But the moment she'd heard through mutual friends that he'd been seen with a new woman, something ugly and possessive had reawakened in her. She'd dated Marcus during the early years of his first company's success, back when his money was good but not yet legendary, and she'd left him the moment a wealthier opportunity presented itself. A decision she'd regretted more with each passing year, as his net worth multiplied beyond anything she'd imagined. Now, sitting in her apartment scrolling through photos she'd paid a private investigator to take, photos of Marcus and some diner waitress walking into his mother's old house, Brianna felt a familiar, dangerous calculation forming in her mind. If she couldn't have him back, she could at least make sure no one else got to keep him either. She knew exactly what that house visit meant, because Marcus had taken her there once 2 years ago, before she'd failed his little test by complaining about the neighborhood within the first 10 minutes. She'd always suspected he ran some kind of evaluation on the women he dated, and watching this new girl pass where she herself had failed ignited a jealousy so sharp it felt physical. Brianna began crafting her plan carefully, deciding the most effective approach wasn't confrontation but infiltration, finding a way to insert herself back into Marcus's orbit under the guise of reconciliation while quietly poisoning his trust in Ava from the shadows. She started making calls that evening, reaching out to mutual acquaintances, gathering information about Ava Carter, the diner, her family, anything that could be twisted into a weapon. By midnight, Brianna had learned that Ava had a younger brother with a complicated legal history and a mother struggling with medical bills. Details easily found through people willing to talk for the right price. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face as she realized how easy this would be, because desperate families made desperate decisions, and desperate decisions could be manufactured to look exactly like greed. She picked up her phone one final time and sent a text to a number she hadn't used in years, a private investigator she'd hired before. "I need you to set up a meeting," she typed. "Someone needs to make an offer that Ava Carter's family can't afford to refuse." Ava's younger sister Tasha had always been the skeptical one in the family, the one who questioned things too good to be true, and something about Ava's sudden romance with a mysterious man named Marcus had been nagging at her for weeks. Over Sunday dinner at their mother's apartment, Tasha watched Ava glow while describing the visit to Marcus's mother's house, the cooking, the laughter, the warmth of a woman who'd clearly approved of her completely. "He never talks about his job, though," Tasha said carefully, picking at her food. "And you said he drives a beat-up truck but pays cash for everything. Something doesn't add up, Ava." Ava waved off the concern, explaining that Marcus was simply a private person who valued substance over flash, someone who clearly didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Their mother, Gloria, who'd been quietly suffering through worsening health problems she hadn't fully disclosed to her daughters, listened to the conversation with tired eyes and a deeper worry than Tasha's surface-level suspicion. Gloria had learned through painful experience that good men sometimes hid things not out of malice but out of fear, and she recognized something familiar in the careful way Ava described Marcus's reluctance to discuss his past. She squeezed Ava's hand across the table and told her to trust her own instincts, that a man who treated his mother and his woman with that kind of respect rarely turned out to be hiding something truly dangerous. But even as she said it, Gloria felt a flutter of anxiety about her own situation, the medical bills piling up in a drawer she hadn't shown anyone, the diagnosis she'd been too afraid to share with her daughters. After dinner, as Ava washed dishes in the cramped kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. A woman introducing herself as a representative from a private consulting firm, requesting a meeting to discuss an opportunity that could benefit her family significantly. Ava nearly deleted it as spam, but something about the specific mention of her mother's name and Tasha's recent troubles made her pause, her thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen. She showed the message to Tasha, who frowned deeply and suggested it might just be a scam targeting vulnerable families, advice that made sense and that Ava intended to follow completely. But 3 days later, walking home from her shift at the diner, Ava noticed the same black car parked across the street that she'd seen twice before that week, and this time, a woman stepped out of it, smiling with a warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. The woman introduced herself as Brianna, claiming to be a friend of Marcus's from his early business days, and she suggested they get coffee to talk about something important regarding his past. Ava's instincts told her to walk away immediately, but Brianna mentioned Marcus's mother by name, mentioned the house, mentioned details specific enough to prove she genuinely knew him, and curiosity won out over caution. They sat at a small cafe table while Brianna carefully constructed her narrative, claiming that Marcus had a pattern of disappearing on women once they got too close, that she herself had been left brokenhearted after years together, and that she only wanted to spare Ava the same painful fate. Every word was calculated to plant doubt without revealing the actual truth Brianna was protecting, careful never to mention the billions of dollars that would have made her jealousy instantly transparent. Ava listened politely, but felt something dishonest radiating from the woman across from her, a performance slightly too smooth, eyes that watched for reactions rather than simply expressing genuine concern. Still, doubt is a persistent weed once planted, and despite her instincts, Ava found herself replaying Brianna's words later that night, wondering about the gaps in what she actually knew about Marcus's past relationships. She decided not to mention the encounter to Marcus directly, telling herself she wanted to observe him more carefully first, watch for the patterns Brianna described, though some part of her recognized this decision itself as a small betrayal of the trust they'd been building. Meanwhile, Brianna left the cafe satisfied, having successfully planted seeds of suspicion without revealing her own motives, confident that doubt would do the rest of her work without further effort on her part. That same evening, Marcus received a call from his business partner, James, informing him that a journalist had been asking unusual questions around his old neighborhood. Questions about a billionaire who frequently visited a rundown house. Questions that suggested someone was preparing to expose his identity publicly before he was ready to reveal it himself. Marcus's mind raced through the implications, knowing that if this story broke before he could tell Ava the truth himself, she would learn about his wealth from strangers, framed in whatever sensationalized way a journalist chose, rather than from him with the honesty he intended. He called Ava immediately, needing to hear her voice, needing to gauge whether anything had shifted between them. And when she answered, her tone carried a careful distance he'd never heard from her before, distant enough that his stomach dropped with dread. "Ava, is everything okay?" he asked, and after a long pause, she finally spoke. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever been with someone named Brianna?" Ava's voice was steady but careful, and Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him, recognizing immediately what must have happened even before she explained the cafe meeting. He answered honestly, admitting that yes, he dated Brianna years ago, that the relationship had ended badly, but he insisted he had no idea how she'd found Ava or why she would approach her now. Ava relayed what Brianna had said about his pattern of disappearing on women, watching for his reaction through the phone, and Marcus felt fury rising in his chest, not at Ava for asking, but at Brianna for using whatever twisted logic she'd constructed to insert herself back into his life through manipulation rather than honesty. He wanted desperately to tell Ava everything right then about the money, about the test the house had represented, about Brianna's real motivations rooted in greed rather than genuine concern for Ava's well-being. But something held him back, a fear that explaining his wealth in this moment, immediately after Brianna had stirred up suspicion, would look exactly like a man scrambling to control a narrative rather than offering honest truth. Instead, he asked Ava to trust him a little longer, promising he would explain everything soon, and he heard the hesitation in her silence before she agreed, though something in her voice had changed, a small distance that hadn't existed before this conversation. After they hung up, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights, wondering if his carefully constructed test had finally created the exact kind of mistrust he'd been trying to avoid all along. The next morning, Ava arrived at the diner to find her manager waiting with unusually serious news. The diner's owner had decided to sell the property to a developer, and all employees would lose their jobs within 30 days unless a buyer interested in keeping the business could be found. Panic set in immediately, because this job had been Ava's lifeline, supporting herself while helping her mother with mounting medical bills that Gloria still hadn't fully explained. As she processed this devastating news, her phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number Brianna had used before, except this time the message wasn't from Brianna at all, but from someone claiming to represent the development company buying the diner property. "We understand your situation. We'd like to discuss how we might help, in exchange for information about Marcus Johnson." Gloria finally sat her daughters down on a quiet Thursday evening, her hands trembling as she revealed what she'd been hiding for nearly 2 months. A diagnosis of early-stage kidney disease that would require expensive treatment and possibly a transplant if her condition worsened. The revelation hit both Ava and Tasha like a physical blow, guilt washing over them for not noticing how exhausted their mother had become, for not pushing harder when she'd brushed off questions about her health with tired smiles. Gloria explained that she hadn't wanted to burden them, especially with Ava's job uncertain and Tasha still working to rebuild her life after her own troubles. But the medical bills had become impossible to manage alone any longer. The weight of this new crisis settled over the small apartment like a physical presence. 3 women suddenly facing a mountain of financial pressure none of them knew how to climb. That night, lying awake in her childhood bedroom, Ava found herself staring at the mysterious text message still sitting unanswered in her phone, the one offering help in exchange for information about Marcus. She knew accepting any kind of payment for details about him would be a profound betrayal, but desperation has a way of making impossible things feel suddenly negotiable, especially with her mother's life potentially hanging in the balance. She thought about calling Marcus to ask for help directly, but pride and fear held her back. Fear that asking for money so soon after Brianna's accusations would prove every doubt the woman had planted. Fear that she'd look exactly like the gold diggers Marcus had apparently encountered before. Instead, she made a decision she would later regret, agreeing to one more meeting with the mysterious contact, telling herself she would simply listen to what they wanted without committing to anything. The meeting took place in a parking garage, away from prying eyes, where a man in an expensive suit introduced himself only as a representative and slid a folder across the hood of his car toward her. Inside were documents detailing a substantial payment, more money than Ava had ever seen offered for anything, in exchange for confirming details about Marcus's financial holdings and his pattern of testing women through the old house visits. Ava's hands shook as she read through the papers, horrified at how much this stranger already knew, realizing with dawning clarity that Marcus must be far wealthier than the simple, private man she'd believed him to be. As she closed the folder and pushed it back across the car, refusing the offer despite everything weighing on her, the man's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something colder. "Think about your mother's treatment, Miss Carter. This offer won't stay on the table forever, and neither will your mother's good health if these bills go unpaid." Ava drove home from that parking garage shaking, the man's veiled threat echoing in her ears, terror and fury tangled together in her chest. She realized now that whatever Marcus was hiding had attracted serious, dangerous attention, and rather than feeling curious about his secrets, she felt only a desperate need to protect both herself and her family from whatever storm was building around them. When she got home, she found Tasha waiting up, worried about where she'd been so late, and Ava finally broke down, telling her sister everything. Brianna's warning, the diner closing, the mysterious offer, the threat in the parking garage. Tasha listened with growing alarm, and when Ava finished, her sister's advice was simple and direct. "You need to step back from this man until you understand what you're actually dealing with." The following day, Marcus called Ava 3 times before she finally answered, her voice flat and exhausted in a way that immediately alarmed him. He asked to see her, sensing something had shifted dramatically since their last conversation. But Ava insisted on meeting in public, at a small park rather than anywhere private, a request that confirmed his growing fear that trust between them had badly fractured. When they finally sat together on a worn park bench, Ava recounted everything that had happened, watching his face carefully for any reaction that might reveal the truth behind all the secrets swirling around him. Marcus felt his careful control slipping as she spoke, horror rising at the realization that someone had threatened her family, that his unresolved past with Brianna had spiraled into genuine danger for the woman he loved. "Ava, I need to tell you something I should have told you weeks ago," he said, his voice rough with the weight of finally letting go of the secret he'd carried since their very first date. But before he could continue, Ava held up her hand, stopping him, tears brimming in her eyes. "Marcus, I don't know what you're hiding, and right now, I'm not sure I have the strength to find out while my mother is sick and my job is disappearing and strangers are threatening my family. I need space, just for a little while, to figure out what's real." She stood and walked away before he could respond, leaving him sitting alone on that bench, the truth he'd finally been ready to share dying unspoken in his throat, while across the park, hidden behind a newspaper, Brianna watched the entire heartbreaking scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Dorothy noticed her son's absence at Sunday dinner for the first time in months, and when she finally reached him by phone, his voice carried a hollowness that worried her more than any words he spoke. He explained everything that had happened, Brianna's interference, the threats against Ava's family, Ava's request for space, and Dorothy listened with the patience of a woman who'd watched her son build emotional walls brick by brick over decades of disappointment. "Baby, you cannot let pride and fear keep you from fighting for something real," she told him firmly. "That girl walked away to protect her family, not because she stopped loving you, and there's a difference between giving someone space and giving up on them entirely." Her words settled into Marcus's chest like a key turning in a lock he hadn't realized was still closed. Meanwhile, the journalist who'd been asking questions around the old neighborhood finally published a story online. a piece revealing Marcus Johnson's billionaire status alongside grainy photos of him visiting his childhood home with an unnamed woman, speculating wildly about his motivations and personal life. The article spread quickly through local news cycles, and within hours, Ava's co-workers at the diner were showing her the story on their phones, asking breathless questions about whether she was the mystery woman pictured walking up that familiar porch. Ava stared at the photos in stunned silence, finally understanding the full scope of what Marcus had been hiding, billions of dollars worth of secrets, and feeling a dizzying mixture of shock, hurt, and reluctant relief that at least now she understood why so many strangers had been circling her family with offers and threats. Tasha found the article too, and her reaction was immediate fury rather than sympathy, convinced that Marcus had been playing some cruel game with her sister's emotions for his own twisted entertainment. But Gloria, reading the same article from her hospital bed during a treatment session, felt something different stirring in her chest, a memory of her own late husband testing her loyalty in smaller ways during their courtship decades ago. Men who'd been hurt before sometimes needing proof that love could exist without ulterior motives. She asked Tasha to bring her phone closer and dialed Ava's number herself, determined to share a perspective her daughters desperately needed to hear before this misunderstanding destroyed something that might be worth saving. But when Ava answered, her mother's voice sounded strange, weaker than it had that morning, and Ava's blood ran cold as Gloria's words slurred slightly. "Baby, something's wrong. I need you to come to the hospital right now." Ava abandoned everything the moment she heard her mother's distressed voice, sprinting from the diner without explaining to her confused co-workers, her hands shaking too violently to drive safely as she navigated toward the hospital. Tasha met her in the emergency room lobby, both sisters terrified and clinging to each other as doctors rushed back and forth, until a physician finally emerged explaining that Gloria's kidney function had deteriorated rapidly, requiring immediate dialysis and likely an expedited transplant evaluation that the family simply couldn't afford without significant financial assistance. The reality of their situation crashed down with brutal clarity. A sister without stable income, a mother facing a medical crisis beyond their resources, and an estranged relationship with the one person who actually had the means to help, if only Ava hadn't pushed him away in confusion and fear. Word of Gloria's hospitalization reached Marcus within hours, not through Ava directly, but through Dorothy, who'd maintained quiet contact with Ava's mother since their first meeting and had grown to genuinely care about the entire Carter family. Dorothy called Marcus immediately, her voice urgent and unwavering. "This is not the time for pride from either of you. That woman needs help, and you have the power to give it, so you get yourself to that hospital right now and you stop waiting for the perfect moment to tell the truth." Marcus didn't hesitate, arranging immediately for Gloria to be transferred to the city's top nephrology specialist, covering every cost without requiring any acknowledgement, determined to help regardless of whether Ava ever forgave him for the secrets that had brought them to this painful point. When Ava arrived at her mother's new hospital room hours later, confused about the sudden transfer to better care, a nurse explained that all expenses had already been covered by an anonymous benefactor, and the specialist assigned to Gloria's case was renowned for exactly this type of treatment. Ava's mind raced toward only one possible explanation, and her suspicion was confirmed moments later when she stepped into the hallway and found Marcus standing there, still wearing the same humble clothes he always wore, looking uncertain and vulnerable in a way she'd never witnessed before. "I know you asked for space," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly, "but I couldn't let your mother suffer while I waited for permission to help the woman I love. Ava, I need to tell you everything now, no more secrets, no more tests, just the truth." Behind him, down the hallway, a familiar figure in an expensive coat watched the reunion unfold with cold, calculating eyes. They found a quiet corner of the hospital waiting room, and Marcus finally told Ava the complete truth he'd been carrying since their very first date at the diner. He explained his rise from poverty to billions, building 3 successful companies through sheer determination and sleepless nights, becoming wealthier than he'd ever imagined possible for a boy who once went to bed hungry in that small blue house. He explained the painful history of women who'd discovered his wealth and changed instantly, becoming demanding and materialistic the moment dollar signs entered the equation, leaving him with deep wounds that made trust feel like an impossible luxury. He explained why he'd taken her to his mother's house disguised in poverty, testing whether she could love the boy from nothing before ever knowing about the empire he'd built, and how every other woman before her had failed that exact test within minutes. Ava listened in stunned silence, processing not just the staggering revelation of his actual wealth, but the deeper implication that their entire relationship had begun as some kind of evaluation, a test she hadn't even known she was taking. Hurt mixed dangerously with understanding as she considered both perspectives. The genuine pain of being secretly assessed without consent, and the equally genuine pain that had driven Marcus to create such elaborate protective measures after years of being used and discarded. She asked him directly why he hadn't simply told her the truth from the beginning, trusted her enough to be honest rather than designing an elaborate test, and Marcus had no answer that didn't sound like fear dressed up as caution. "I was wrong to test you without your knowledge," he admitted finally. "You deserved honesty from the start, not an experiment." The weight of his confession hung between them, heavy and unresolved, when Brianna suddenly appeared at the edge of the waiting room, having followed Marcus to the hospital with her own agenda finally ready to be revealed. "Since we're being honest," she said with a sharp, triumphant smile, "perhaps Ava should know that I'm the one who sent that journalist your address, Marcus. And perhaps she should also know that I offered her family money to spy on you, money they desperately needed for medical bills, which makes me wonder how loyal her refusal really was, or whether she's simply holding out for an even bigger payout now that she knows exactly how much you're worth." The accusation landed like a slap, twisting Ava's genuine sacrifice into something ugly and calculated, and Marcus watched Ava's face crumble with humiliation and fury as the worst possible interpretation of her actions hung in the air between them. Marcus turned on Brianna with controlled fury, his voice low and dangerous in a way Ava had never heard from him before. "You threatened her family, manipulated a journalist, and tried to buy information about my private life, and you have the audacity to stand here questioning her loyalty?" He explained quickly to Ava what he already suspected, but hadn't confirmed until this moment, that Brianna's jealousy over losing access to his wealth years ago had driven every act of sabotage since the moment she'd learned about their relationship. Brianna's confident smile faltered slightly under the weight of his accusation, but she pressed forward anyway, insisting that Ava's refusal of the parking garage offer proved nothing except patience, that anyone smart enough would wait for a bigger prize once they understood the full scope of Marcus's fortune. Ava finally found her voice, stepping forward with a calm dignity that surprised even herself given the chaos of the moment. "I refused that money because taking it would have meant betraying someone I cared about, even when I didn't fully understand what I was protecting," she said steadily, looking directly at Brianna rather than at Marcus. "And honestly, the fact that you're standing here trying to twist my integrity into greed tells me everything I need to know about how you operate. I don't need Marcus's money to feel secure about who I am, but clearly you do, otherwise none of this elaborate scheme would have been necessary." The words landed with such quiet conviction that even the hospital security guard who'd wandered over, alerted by the rising tension, seemed to sense which woman in this confrontation deserved his attention and concern. Marcus called hospital security to formally escort Brianna from the premises, finally done allowing her toxic influence to poison his life and relationships any further, while Ava stood quietly processing the magnitude of everything revealed in just the past hour. As Brianna was led away, still hurling accusations over her shoulder about gold diggers and opportunists, Ava turned to Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read, exhaustion and hurt and something else mixed together. "I believe you about Brianna," she said slowly, "but I still need time to process the fact that you tested me without my consent, that you let me fall in love with a version of you that wasn't even the full truth. Trust isn't rebuilt in one conversation, Marcus, even when the conversation is finally honest." She walked back toward her mother's hospital room, leaving Marcus standing alone in the waiting area, uncertain whether the truth he'd finally shared had saved their relationship or delivered its final blow. Gloria, still weak but lucid after her emergency treatment, asked to speak privately with Ava once Tasha stepped out to get coffee, sensing her daughter's turmoil despite Ava's attempts to mask it for her mother's sake. Ava finally broke down completely, telling her mother everything. The staggering revelation of Marcus's billions, the painful truth about being secretly tested, Brianna's vicious manipulation, and her own confusion about whether she could trust a relationship built on such a complicated foundation. Gloria listened with the calm wisdom of a woman who'd faced her own share of difficult decisions, taking her daughter's hand gently before responding. "Baby, every person carries fear into love. Some people just have bigger reasons and bigger resources to act on theirs. The question isn't whether his methods were perfect, because they weren't, but whether his heart was genuinely seeking something real or trying to manipulate you for his own selfish gain." Ava considered this, replaying every moment since meeting Marcus through new eyes, remembering his genuine warmth with his mother, his vulnerability when discussing his childhood poverty, the way he'd looked at her in that hospital hallway like a man finally setting down a burden too heavy to carry alone any longer. Gloria continued softly, sharing a story Ava had never heard before, about how her own late husband had once let her believe he was barely scraping by during their early courtship, afraid that revealing his small but steady inheritance might attract the wrong kind of attention from a woman still recovering from a previous heartbreak. "He told me everything eventually, just like Marcus did, and our marriage was stronger for the honesty that followed, even though the deception that came before it stung for a while." Ava absorbed her mother's words, feeling something shift inside her, a softening toward the possibility of forgiveness she hadn't been ready to consider just hours earlier. As their conversation deepened, a nurse entered with updated test results, and Gloria's doctor followed shortly after with news that complicated everything further. Gloria would need a kidney transplant sooner than initially expected, and given her specific blood type and antibody profile, finding a compatible donor through standard channels could take months they didn't have. The doctor explained gently that family members were typically tested first, and Tasha, returning just in time to hear this news, immediately volunteered without hesitation despite her own health uncertainties. But when the preliminary screening revealed Tasha wasn't a viable match due to an underlying condition she hadn't known she had, the room fell into a heavy, frightened silence, broken only when Ava, swallowing her own fear, stepped forward and asked the question that would test her own courage just as profoundly as Marcus's test had once tested hers. "Test me. I want to know if I can be her donor." The testing process took agonizing days, during which Marcus, despite Ava's request for space, found himself unable to stay away entirely, sending quiet support through Dorothy, and ensuring Gloria's medical team had every resource necessary without ever pushing himself directly into Ava's path. Dorothy visited the hospital regularly now, having grown to love Gloria as a friend independent of her son's romantic complications, and the two older women spent hours talking about faith, struggle, and the particular resilience required of mothers who'd raised children through poverty and hardship. Through Dorothy, Marcus learned that Ava had volunteered as a potential transplant donor, a piece of news that struck him with profound respect for a woman willing to undergo significant medical risk and recovery for her mother's sake, reinforcing everything he'd already believed about her character beneath the chaos of recent weeks. When the test results finally arrived, Ava was confirmed as a viable match, and the relief in that hospital room was immediate and overwhelming, tears flowing freely between the sisters as Gloria wept with gratitude and guilt simultaneously, hating that her illness required such sacrifice from her own child. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks out, giving the family time to prepare, and Ava found herself reflecting deeply during those quiet days about courage, sacrifice, and what genuine love actually required versus what fear made it feel like it required. She thought about Marcus's test, designed from a place of fear and self-protection, and compared it to her own willingness to risk her body and health for her mother, an act of love requiring no test or proof, simply offered because love demanded nothing less when someone you cherished was suffering. The realization crystallized something important in her understanding of Marcus's actions, not excusing his deception entirely, but contextualizing it within a framework she now understood more deeply. Fear could make even loving people act in protective, flawed ways, and the true measure of character lay not in never making mistakes, but in how honestly someone confronted and corrected them once revealed. She reached out to Marcus 3 days before her scheduled surgery, asking him to visit, and when he arrived at the hospital looking nervous and hopeful in equal measure, She met him in the same waiting room where Brianna's accusations had once nearly destroyed everything between them. "I'm not fully healed from feeling tested without my knowledge," she told him honestly. "But I'm ready to try rebuilding trust slowly, starting now, if you're willing to be patient with me the way I'm trying to be patient with understanding your fear." Marcus's relief was so profound he had to look away briefly to compose himself. And when he looked back, he saw something in Ava's eyes that gave him the courage to ask the question that had been building in his heart for weeks. "Ava, when you're recovered from surgery, I want to take you somewhere, and this time there will be no tests, no hidden identities, no secrets of any kind," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of what he was about to propose. "I want to take you to see the life I actually live, the company I built, the home I actually own, not because I need you to be impressed, but because I want you to know every part of me, the boy from that small blue house and the man who built an empire, both equally real and both equally yours to know completely." Ava's eyes filled with tears at the genuine humility in his offer. Recognizing the significant difference between this invitation and the disguised test he'd extended weeks earlier. An invitation built entirely on transparency rather than evaluation. The surgery proceeded successfully 2 days later, with Ava recovering steadily under careful medical supervision, while Gloria's body began accepting the donated kidney with promising initial results that brought tremendous relief to the entire family. Marcus visited daily during recovery, never overstepping the careful boundaries Ava had established, simply present and reliable in ways that slowly rebuilt the foundation of trust between them, bringing Dorothy along often enough that the two families began feeling less like separate units and more like one extending, complicated, loving whole. Tasha, initially the most skeptical about Marcus's intentions, found her own guard softening as she watched his consistent, patient devotion through weeks of difficulty, eventually admitting to Ava privately that perhaps she'd misjudged a man capable of such genuine care during crisis. 3 weeks after the surgery, once Ava had regained sufficient strength, Marcus finally fulfilled his promise, picking her up not in the old pickup truck but in a sleek black car, driving her not toward poverty but toward the gleaming high-rise where his actual penthouse occupied the top 3 floors, offering panoramic views of the entire city below. He walked her through his real life piece by piece, the company headquarters where hundreds of employees built products improving thousands of lives, the modest but elegant home that reflected genuine taste rather than ostentatious display, and finally, a small room he'd kept private from everyone, containing nothing but photographs and mementos from his childhood, preserved carefully as reminders of where he'd come from and who he never wanted to forget being. Standing in that quiet room, surrounded by evidence of both his struggle and his triumph, Marcus turned to Ava and asked the question he'd been building toward since the night Brianna's accusations had nearly destroyed everything between them. "Ava Carter, I've watched you choose honesty over easy money in a parking garage when you were desperate. I've watched you choose your mother's life over your own comfort and safety. I've watched you love a man you believed was poor with the exact same warmth you've shown me since learning I'm worth billions. And that consistency has taught me more about your character than any test I could have designed," Marcus said, his hands trembling slightly as he opened a small box containing a ring far simpler than his wealth could have afforded, chosen deliberately for its understated elegance rather than ostentatious size. "I'm done testing people, but if I were still testing, you would have passed every single version of this test from the very first moment we met. Will you marry me, knowing everything now, the billions and the boy from that small blue house, both completely yours?" Ava's answer came through tears and laughter mixed together, a clear and immediate yes that required no hesitation, no calculation about what this proposal meant for her financial future, simply pure joy at the prospect of building a life with a man whose heart she'd come to know intimately before ever understanding the scope of his wealth. The wedding that followed months later was held not in some grand mansion or exclusive venue, but in the small backyard of Dorothy's blue house, the same yard where Marcus had once stood watching shadows in the dark, transformed now with string lights and folding chairs and the genuine joy of two families merged through love rather than convenience. Dorothy cried through the entire ceremony, watching her son marry a woman who'd loved him exactly as he was before ever knowing what he had, while Gloria, recovered and strong again, stood as a witness to her daughter's happiness with a heart full of gratitude for second chances and unexpected blessings. As for the reaction everyone expected when Ava finally absorbed the full reality of marrying a billionaire, the excitement over yachts and mansions and unlimited luxury that should have accompanied such news, it simply never materialized in the way anyone anticipated. Reporters who eventually covered their wedding noted with fascination that Ava Carter continued waitressing part-time at the same small diner for months after the ceremony, that she insisted on modest living spaces despite Marcus's wealth, that her joy seemed rooted entirely in family dinners and quiet evenings, rather than any display of newfound fortune. When asked directly by a curious journalist what it felt like discovering her husband was a billionaire, Ava simply smiled and gave an answer that would be quoted for years afterward. "I fell in love with a man in a small blue house who made me feel like the richest woman alive with nothing but his honesty and his mother's kitchen table. The money never changed how rich our love already was. It just gave us more rooms to fill with the same kind of love we'd already built from nothing." And in that small blue house that still stood at the edge of a struggling neighborhood, now beautifully restored but never abandoned, two families gathered every Sunday for dinner, proof that the truest wealth had never been about money at all, but about hearts brave enough to be honestly known.